about one of the cool things we could do with HTML5. So one of the things that HTML5 is trying to do is to bring richness into web development. Now, as much as we could be doing several things, for example, we could be do interactiveness, Ajaxing, provide a user interaction. One thing that's been lacking quite a bit was about drawing things, if you will. Visualization is something fairly important in a lot of projects. For example, I have some clients who are into quite a bit of modeling and visualization, where they have to take some engineering data and they would have to display it. And oftentimes the problem that they run into is they want to build applications, and most of the time they tend to prefer a desktop or a native application because the richness that it provides in drawing and visualization. But oftentimes if their clients are interested in using a web application, the problem often is, how do you really display this? One option they have is to use something like Flash, which is powerful but has certain issues. For example, certain devices may not support it properly, and there are other issues that we don't have to get into. The other option they have is to draw things on the server side and then push an image, but that again has a problem of bandwidth and doing more computation on the server side rather than client side. Doesn't provide quite interactivity as you would if something was available on the client side itself. So with all this given, what we want to do is something that would give us the power to draw things. Enters Canvas. So Canvas is a fairly powerful feature in HTML5 where you can pretty much take an area of the window and say, that area in the window is something where we're going to draw things on, and let's gain access to it. If you have ever done programming with certain graphic tools, be it .NET facilities to draw things on a window, or you have used, let's say, a Java side like Swing and so on, you pretty much know most of what you need to know to be able to use it. It's a question of different API mostly, but the concepts are fairly similar. There are a few things we have to keep in mind as differences, though. One of them is that you will have to write JavaScript. And keep in mind that JavaScript is single-threaded. It's not really multi-threaded. In the case of Windows programming or in the case of Java GUI programming, you normally create worker threads to do stuff, and then you would post back things on the main thread to get things done. In the case of using canvases, though, you've got to be a bit more careful and start putting things in other threads to do things. But once you kind of get a hang of it, it's really not that difficult at all to do it. It really is a bit labor intensive as it stands to get things done. So how do we go about doing this? First of all, the HTML5 supports it. So at the very top here, I have doc type HTML. That's what you see up here as the type that I've displayed for us to see the particular fact that we are using HTML5 itself in here. Now, given this, I'm going to open this page over here so we can take a look at it. And in this particular case, I don't have any content on this page whatsoever, but we're going to start putting some contents along the way in just a few minutes. So let's just start with a little test to make sure we're able to display the content. Now, as I go through and work along, right in the background, I'm going to be displaying the content so we can kind of see it, and I'll switch over to the window when it's necessary, but you can see that it's going to update it along the way. I've just got a script there that's updating so we can see what I'm doing. So the first thing, of course, is on the HTML page, I want to have a canvas. So what is a canvas? A canvas is just an area of window that we can draw into. Now, it's quite possible that we are using HTML5, and HTML5 support really varies widely across browsers and versions of browsers. So what's going to happen if a browser doesn't support Canvas? It may support HTML5 partly, but not entirely. Well, the good news is, within this, I'm going to say, please use another browser, or whatever you want to type over here, you could write that. But notice in this case, as soon as I type that, if I look at the output, it doesn't show anything. And the reason is, thankfully, this browser supports Canvas. And when the browser supports Canvas, what invariably it does is it totally ignores what's within the Canvas area. So anything you put inside of it, it totally gets ignored, which is a good news and a bad news. Good news is you would use the space to really talk to browsers that don't support canvases. So you could put messages like, why don't you go get a real browser or something like that, right? Or you can say, here's an image I want to embed, or you can start using plugins and stuff like that. On the other hand, if the browser does support canvases, then that part is ignored. What you really want to work with, of course, is the area that you provide here. So for example, I could say height equals, let's say 400, and then I could also say that width is going to be, let's say 300. So you could start specifying some areas for the canvas. You still don't see anything because the canvas is just an area, but it's available for us to use. And then, of course, I can say below canvas over here just for us to see this. And we could put that into a P tag, if you will. And you can see that that tag is going to appear on the output, hopefully that if I did this correctly. And we can take a look at the content at this point and see how that appears. Let's make sure it's making me a liar here. It's not appearing here. Let's put this into the body tag just in case, but I don't think that's a problem. So in here, of course, we have the canvas at this point, and of course, we have the little element that I want to show right below as well. So given this, what do you want to do is you want to draw stuff onto the elements itself. That's what you want to access. And so how do you go about doing it? Well, a lot of HTML5 features, we don't write much code at all, but when it comes to canvases, be ready to write quite a bit of code. Not only do you have to write quite a bit of code in JavaScript, you also have to be fairly comfortable with quite a bit of math as well, because oftentimes you're going to be interacting with the structures, so you may have to do point detection, you may have to really compute where things are and stuff like that. It also becomes fairly exciting, not when you just draw things, but also when you start animating things. Then it's even more fun, but that requires a little bit more effort for running the code as well. So that is something that we need to be aware of and be careful about as we work through it. So given this, how do we go about using some of these features? So the first thing, of course, I would start out is by writing a little script that I want to write. So I'm going to put a head section. And in the head section, I'm going to refer to a script. Now, of course, we all can agree quickly that putting JavaScript in HTML should be crime punishable under law, right? Nobody should put JavaScript in HTML. That's a really poor programming practice. So we'll quickly draw into another file that we can refer to. So I have a draw.js file, which is empty right now. And I'm going to refer to the draw.js file and refer to this file where we're going to put the JavaScript itself. And one of the things I try to do is when I write JavaScript, I try to be as less invasive as possible, meaning I want to reduce coupling between the HTML and the JavaScript itself. So I'll be a little bit sensitive to that as I write code. So in this case, of course, I want to go ahead and display a canvas. And the canvas is going to have an ID in this case. I'll just call it my canvas. And so that's the canvas I want to draw into as we go through it over here. So you can see the canvas occupying the space above, and you can see the below canvas appearing in the bottom of the view. Now, what do I want to do here? I want to just simply call a method called draw. Let's start with that for a minute. And I want to draw something on the canvas, maybe work with it. Now, to draw, I need to know where to draw stuff. So obviously, I need to give him the document .canvas. So basically, in this case, get element by ID. So this is going to give him the element, and I called it my canvas, and that's the element I want to pass to this object, and he's going to use that. Let's start with baby steps first of all. So I'm going to go into this document, the draw.js. So I'm going to write the draw function, and the function, of course, is going to take a canvas as a parameter here, and then we're going to say drawing just to be sure that it's actually calling into this. So I want to call into this method, obviously, when we do load this up so that we can draw some picture or whatever content we want to draw, and I want to display that. So that's the first step in getting this completed. Once we have the canvas area in access to us, we can then start manipulating. But how do we go about doing that? Well, you would use a canvas 2D object if you're interested in talking to it. So let's get to that point in just a second. So in this case, of course, I've said script, and the source is going to be draw.js, and the draw.js is sitting right here. So does anybody see what the problem is, that it doesn't display the command? That was very helpful. That's good. I love pair programming. This is multi-programming. So one of you who can speak. ID. So this is going to be the ID over here, my canvas. So this is going to be element by ID. Of course, that would help to put the ID in there, isn't it? Absolutely. So, but it's still not displaying the content over here. So what am I doing? What was that? I don't think I need a window dot. No, definitely not. So I want to alert the value up here, right? So I'm going to alert this. I call the draw. I'm even calling the draw method. That's the question. So where is the context of that? So let's go ahead and move this guy down here. There's some quirks that you have to work with, right, from time to time. Is this in the right place? Is the script in the right place? Script, do I need to say language? I don't think that's optional, right? Did I type the wrong name? My canvas. My canvas. That's correct name, right? Anybody sees the problem? Document. So let's replace all of this for a second. It's even getting here. So there you go. So this script is not picking up. Why is that script not picking up? I don't think I need the language tag at all, no. Anybody knows what the problem is? Naresha, what is it? No need for source. What should I do instead? Just script, that's it? Oh, this body should be separate, isn't it? That's correct. So this should be a separate script block. So you're referring to the script over there. So script, that's correct. So alert over here. So because I'm referring to the script over there, keep that separate. There we go. Thank you. So that's how we debug, right? Okay. So you have the reference to the script itself. I want to say document. So document.getElement by ID. And of course, in this case, I want to refer to the document. You do want to keep them separate, by the way. So that is going to be the document that I'm referring to. What are we getting, by the way? This is the fun part. Notice that we got an object of the canvas object. So it says object HTML canvas element. And the reason is, in this particular case, we have sent an object of canvas over here. And that's what we are getting access to within this canvas object. Now that we have the canvas object, what's the next step to do? I'm going to say context over here is going to be canvas.getContext. And by the way, there are two kinds of context available to us. One is a 2D context, which is what we're going to use mostly here. There is also a 3D context, but the 3D context is kind of in development at this time. So we can take a look at the context object. We just saw the HTML, the canvas object a minute ago. But if you take a look at the object over here, it says a canvas element. Basically, that's a context object we are dealing with at this time. So once you get a context on your hand, so you can think of, this is again a very crude description, don't take it literally, but a lot of times you can think of a context as like a pen or a context using which you can draw things. And then of course a canvas is the area on which you're going to draw stuff itself. That is something to work with. So given this, I want to draw certain things. Where do I draw things? Well, let's start with something that I want to draw right in the middle of this. So obviously one of the things you would need is the width and the height. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is you don't have much control over the window size because you could resize things. For example, you also keep in mind this may be on a computer, on a browser, but oftentimes you may use an iPad or you may use a mobile device to view things. So what is the area that's available to you is something you may have to control. And even here, it's a bad idea to hard code the height and the width, because you may change that in the HTML, and then of course your code is going to be broken. And there's nothing more frustrating than having to keep changing things. So keep in mind good design principles, right? Keeping things dry, meaning don't repeat yourself. Every single source of knowledge should have one authoritative representation. So the width and the height are authoritatively represented in the HTML. Don't mess with it in the code. So oftentimes what I would do is I would define a width over here, but I would quickly get the width from the canvas itself. That way I can make all my calculations based on that width. And also I would say height over here, and then base that based on the height given to us as well, so that we are not really duplicating effort in this case. Once you get this, of course, I can say something like center equals, And feel free to use JSON objects quite a bit because that can become much easier to work with. So center of this is going to be a width over 2, and I can say the height is going to be a height over 2. And then I've used a JSON object to represent the width and the height. So these things can reduce the amount of effort we have to put into the code as we write it, and that can help just a little bit. So now that I have a center on my hand, I can say context dot, and I could start drawing text onto it. So let's say the text I want to draw is hello world. And of course, I need to say where to put it. So I'm going to say center.x and center.y is the location where I would like to draw the text itself in this particular case. So how does this appear in the code? Let's go ahead and try this out. So let me go ahead and refresh this guy so we can get the content in place. What did I do? Call the proper method. That would actually help. Thank you. So draw basically in this case document dot. And of course, I need to specify the get element by ID. And in this case, of course, the canvas is the one that I'm interested in calling. So let's go ahead and send it. So my canvas is what I'm going to send over here. We are drawing the content into the page. Where does that come across? So I'm going to use a few things I need to get ready to do this. But first thing is to do a fill text. So let's do a fill text on this guy. So the fill text basically is going to fill a text area that I want to draw into. And you right here see the hello world pop up right here. But you can start messing with a few interesting things, a few interesting properties on it. For example, you can tell him what font you want to use on this particular content. So as you go through it, before you draw the content, you can say context.font, and then you can specify what font you want to use. For example, I want to use, let's say, Arial, and then I could say 32 points, for instance. I could start dictating some of the font constructs I want to use. You can also tell him where to put the text itself. So in this case, I'm going to say context.text align, and I could want to say that the text should be aligned center, for example, or to the left. Now, what does it mean, center or the left? So let's say left over here for a second and see what it does. So essentially, the idea is that you want to align, spell it correctly though. So what does this mean? To put it left and put it right and center, what do those provide for us? Let's think about this for a second. Notice what happened just now. I moved it to center, and it kind of moved to the left if you noticed. I'm going to put left over here, and you can see it kind of moved to the right, which is kind of counterintuitive if you think about it. What's going on? Well, you mentioned a point around which you want to draw. The alignment is with the reference to the point where you are drawing, not with the respect to the window itself. So in other words, you're saying, here is a point, I'm going to put the pen. Do you want to align it to the left of the point, or to the right of the point, or to the center of the point? So you got to kind of know what these things mean when it comes to drawing these things. So in this case, of course, I said put it in the center. Let's try the right here for a second, and you would notice that it goes all the way here because everything is to its right. And of course, in this case, I'm going to say center, and the point is right in the middle in this case. So that is about alignment. Similarly, you could use a few other things. For example, you can use a fill style. So what would a fill style do? So in this case, I'm going to say context.fill style. And let's say in this fill style, I want to say orange, or choose your favorite color, by the way, whatever color you like. And you can see that it gives you the orange color, which is quite unappealing to see in this color here, but it nevertheless changes the color of what you're displaying. So we just kind of started displaying a certain content. Now, one of the cool things you can do is you can also vary the transparency level of content. So there are times when you want to display certain things, but you want to vary transparency so you can see what's behind it, what's in the front of it, all these wonderful things you can do. So this is done usually through what is called a global alpha. So think about this as opacity. So context.global alpha, and this value, by the way, is a value between 0 and 1. And when you change that, I don't know if you're able to notice this, but it is actually transparent now than it was before. And maybe people in the front row can squint their eyes and say it's actually still visible, but it is about half visible, and the transparency level has been modified. So just to kind of show that, I'll increase the transparency level to 0.9. You can see that appear a little bit brighter now, so you can start varying the transparency of things. So we merely scratch the surface here. We just are drawing stuff on the window. But this takes us to the next level where we want to interact with it to do other graphics on it. And eventually we'll get to the point where we could start doing some animations as well. Now, how do we go about drawing lines on it? Now, one of the things, this can be a little bit annoying, but when you're drawing things, you kind of have to keep a context in your head. And this is, but when I said it can be annoying, to a certain extent, I would argue that is the part I really love about the field that we are in. Because we are in a field where we build a lot of stuff in our head. And to me, that is the most fulfilling part of our profession, is that you think about something in your head and then you're able to code it in and express it, and that's extremely powerful. So as you are building some of these things, you need to kind of keep track of what your context is, where you are, and the more you're able to do that, it becomes extremely helpful to work with it. If you kind of lose that context, of course, then it becomes really problematic to know where things are and where you're drawing. So what is a begin path? A begin path basically is there's a virtual path you're going to draw, and you're saying, I'm going to start this path, and I'm going to start drawing things on this path until I finish the path, and then it's going to stroke at that point. So you got to kind of know how to work with it. Let's look at an example. I want to draw a line, let's say. Where do I draw the line? So let's go back to this. I don't want to draw the text anymore, so look, we can kind of get rid of this. And instead of drawing the text, I'm going to go ahead and draw a line. So I know what the center is. Let's draw a line quite across, if you will. So context start, and I can specify, in this case, a begin path. So I'm going to say, in this case, begin path. And once I begin the path, I can say context dot move to. And where do I want to move? On the x-axis, I want to move to the 0. And on the y-axis, I want to move to the center dot y. So I've asked him to move this virtual cursor or a mouse or a point to the move x. Then I can ask him to draw from there to the point where I would like to display the content. So in this case, we could say context dot, like we can say line 2. And I want to draw the line right across. So x is going to be the width itself. And then, of course, the center dot y is still the height. Now, you need to tell him what to do. So context dot stroke is going to ask him to draw a line or draw a stroke. And you can see the stroke appeared right there as you were drawing through it. Now, of course, you can change a lot of stuff around it. You can tell him what color you want for it, what width you want for it. I'm just writing on the defaults at this point, but you can change a lot of these values around if you're interested. So you could go ahead and say a few things. For example, in this case, you can say, I want to take a stroke style and a line width. So if you were to control the line width, for example, obviously do this right after you start this, and you say line width is going to be, let's say, a 10-point width, and then you can specify what the size should be. You can see that's much bigger now. And similarly, what is the style going to do? You can think of the style as a way to color this. So stroke style, basically, here is going to be, let's say, a red in color, and we could modify the color of the content. Again, you can see that it's red in color. So you can start modifying some of these things. Notice the similarity between the fill style I had a few minutes ago and the stroke style that I'm using. Fill style is to tell the color to fill for a text and stuff like that. Stroke, of course, is for the strokes that you draw, that you are specifying what the color should be and things like that. Now, these are simple so far. Now, where it gets a little bit complex is when you want to draw a circle. So I want you to kind of slow down a little bit and think about how you would draw a circle. So imagine for a minute that this is your canvas that you see in front of you, and imagine there's a big circle standing in front of you. Now, the way you would specify the circle is you would draw a circle by just drawing an arc. So what that means is to draw a circle, you would draw a full arc, but you can also draw parts of an arc anytime you're interested. So in other words, you will tell him where to start drawing, and then just imagine how you would draw if you were instructing yourself to draw. You would first say, where do you want to put the point, and then you would decide whether you want to draw the circle this way or you want to draw the circle that way. So there is an anti-clockwise and there's a clockwise depending on how you want to do this, right? But how do you say where the point is? Well, you specify where the point is based on an angle. On the angle, basically, this is the most confusing part until you get used to it. The horizontal line is the angle 0, by the way. So the point over here is going to be 0. And if I want to draw arc from here up to here, What I'm going to do is I'm going to say draw from 0, and I'm going to go halfway into a pi, right? So you know that the circle is 2 pi, and you're going to specify half the pi, or a quarter of a pi, depending on how you want to do. And then, of course, if you said go counterclockwise, it draws up. If you say go clockwise, it draws down, and you can start controlling it. So let's see how this is going to look like with an example. So I'm going to draw an arc, and of course, you've got to control a few more things on the arc itself, but we'll come back to that in a minute. So context.arc, and what are the parameters the arc is going to take? First of all, you got to tell him where to start, which point to start at. So I'm going to start at 0, and I'm going to ask him to go for a value of pi, and so I can just say 1 pi, math.pi is the value I'm going to specify, and then I can tell him where the center is going to be, right? So I can tell him the center x and center y values that he has to start with, and then of course you have to also tell him the counterclockwise or clockwise direction he needs to go into. So center.x and center.y, and if memory serves me right, those come as the first parameter. So you will start with center x and center y because I want the circle to be centered on my window, and I give him the path, and I'm going to say true over here to tell him where I want this to be drawn in this particular case. So given these values, the arc is going to say, I'm going to start with the center of x and center of y, start at a value of 0, meaning that I want to start at the horizontal line mark, but I want to go up to a pi value, right? And then you're specifying that. Obviously, I made a mistake here. Let's figure out what the problem here is. So x and y are, of course, how can I forget the wonderful radius I want to draw into? So let's give a value of radius. What should the radius be, by the way? Now, your temptation may be to plug in a value, but keep in mind something. There are times when you want things to be definitely small, right? But there are times when you want things to be relative to the size of the window, and there's no good answer to it. It depends on what you're trying to do. There are times when something should be of a particular size. Other times it varies based on the size of the window. In this case, of course, I'm going to simply say that I want this to be the width of the window. Let's say width divided by, let's say 2 is the size I want to specify for drawing this thing, right? So I'm going to specify the x, y, and r, then a start angle and an end angle, and then of course I'm going to specify whether it's going to be clockwise or anti-clockwise in drawing the content itself. Now, okay, we drew that, but what is missing here? I want to say context dot stroke style. Let's go ahead and specify that the style I want this for this is going to be red in color. And then when you're done with it, I'm going to say context.stroke and say complete the path for me for the circle itself. Well, that was one big circle. So let's go ahead and make it much smaller. Let's say 10 times that size. And you can see that it's drawing the circle right there. So what I said was, I said I want to start at an angle of 0. And I said go up to an angle of pi. And so that is the angle of pi. But we told him to go anti-clockwise. What you're not seeing here is a true, I said. So he's going anti-clockwise to draw that. And of course, when you're done with it, you got to do the stroke. So in other words, he's kind of drawing everything in the hidden page, and then when you stroke it, he makes it visible, right? Now, on the other hand, of course, if I'm interested, I could have set, in this case, a false. And if I change this to a false, then you can see that it quite inverts the circle because you told him to go clockwise. Now, you could argue, can't you just say anti-clockwise, but then start with pi and go to 0? You can certainly do that as well. But you got to know what you're saying right here, because it may decide on what it draws based on the angle references. So is it 2 pi or pi is something you got to be careful with. So we specified the angle and the values to it. Let's try a couple of things here, if you will. So going back to this, I'm going to ask him to go one full circle. So this is going to be 2 pi. So at this point, it doesn't matter whether you specify clockwise or anti-clockwise. It doesn't matter because you went one full circle, isn't it? So that's perfectly fine. But if you're drawing these things, you can then start combining with other things if you're interested in. For instance, I could then go back to this guy and say, I want you to move to, so context dot move to, and I want you to move to the center, so center.x and center.y. So we are at the center now. But from there, I want to go into one of the points on the circle. Remember the day you skipped math school? That comes back to haunt you right now, right? Because you got to know trigonometry. You got to know where to select on. I'll share with you later on, by the way, one of the most rewarding things for me that happened recently is my son wanted to develop a HTML5 application, and so he developed this, and this involved enormous amount of math. But he's 14 years old, but he's in advanced math. So he's actually going to 8th grade right now, but he's going to the 12th grade for math. So he's in a pretty advanced math. He knows more math than I do, actually. So this was a good experience because he was able to apply all the math knowledge he has gained over the years to do something really in action. It was quite interesting to watch him actually do stuff and then see that it actually works. But one of the first things he said was, he said two things that was very profound in my opinion. The first thing he said is, computers are so stupid, Daddy. And he said, because you have to tell them everything to do. And so he started to realize that you got to specify every action for it to do. And the next thing he said was, he looked at my wife and said, now I fully understand why Daddy needs a steady supply of junk food while he's coding. So that is another thing he mentioned. So these are the quite a bit of traits that we know as programmers. He was kind of hooking on to it. But in this particular case that he was developing, I'll show you later on, we had to apply quite an amount of math actually, so that comes in very handy. So where am I going to go in here? So context.line2, and where do I draw the line to? Of course, a point x and point y, but what is the x point I want to draw into? The x point I want to draw into is going to be considered using this formula I'm going to just steal from here. So this is going to be the center.x, if you will. And then I want to specify the radius. Now, it's a good idea to really take the radius away and put it as a separate variable. So radius equals, and then we will just say over here, the context dot, let's call this, the canvas center, right? So width over 20, that's what I called it. So let's go ahead and rename this to radius. And of course, in this case, it's going to be the radius value I want to use in this code. So this is going to be the radius itself. And then, of course, I want to use a cosine of whatever angle that I want to go into, right? So what is going to be the angle that I'm interested in? Well, I'm interested in about maybe a 45-degree angle. So if I want to draw the circle over here, to the point over here, what is that going to be? Oh, that's going to be from 0, and this I know is going to be 1.5, so somewhere in between those two. I'll vary this around, but I'll start with the 0.5, and then we can change it around in a few minutes. So I'm asking to draw the line up to this point in the circle, but let me also draw the stroke first of all, and then we'll come back to do this. So take the stroke first of all, draw the stroke, and then of course come back and draw the move circle, and then draw that content. So right there is the circle. I don't think it shows up the angle here, the line here. So line 2, center x. Of course, I need to specify the center y, isn't it? So center y is the center point I want to start with. And where does the y go in this particular case? So that is going to be a plus, in this case, radius times a sine operation. By the way, where does sine come from? Math.cosine, right? And then, of course, math.sine. So let's call this as math.sine. And this is going to be, let's say, 0.5 as well for now. We can start with those values. That was not too bad. So that's the line that I drew right there. We can then start adding other sequence of lines, if you will. So now that I have done a move to, I'm going to just copy that over, going back to the center one more time. But this time I'm going to say a minus sign over here and see where that goes. And the second line I want to draw in this particular case. So this is going to be x minus the radius that I want to start with, because I want to go to the left side of this itself. And you can see I drew the line right there. So you can start drawing things, and now you can draw a peace sign by putting another line, so you kind of get the point about how we can draw this. So you can draw the points on the circle and start building these things. You can fill in the shapes if you're interested. For example, in the arc, we notice that, let me get rid of these points for now. You use the stroke to draw this, but instead of this, I could simply say a context.fill style and ask him to fill a particular content itself. This is basically to say, I don't want to draw the stroke, but I really want to go about and draw the style itself in this case. So this is going to be, let's say, a blue color. Let's call it blue. And then, of course, I'm going to say dot fill instead of a stroke. Now, what does the stroke do? A stroke is drawing lines. A fill is filling the area with the color that you specified. Once again, you got to be a bit careful when you do these things, because it depends on what context you are covered. And sometimes when you are programming, you may make a mistake, and all kinds of weird shapes come up on the picture. Sometimes you're tempted to say, this is actually much better than what I wanted to do. No, that's not what your intent is. So keep track of what you're trying to do and then follow through it. So we have a little filling here. Now, I want to mention one more thing here that comes in fairly handy. As you are working through things, you will get to a point where you need to follow a certain pattern of structures you want to draw. For example, you may want to draw a red color line, let's say, then you want to draw a blue color line, then you want to draw a red color line, and you notice you are duplicating code between these two endpoints, and that can become very frustrating. And you say, you know what, I draw this, it would be so nice if I can somehow save all this information and then do another drawing and then somehow restore back the settings and move on. In other words, save and restore literally follow the memento pattern. So essentially, your context object contains a state, if you will. It knows the colors you are using, the position you have set, and all those good stuff. And then you do a save. It literally makes a clone of the context and keeps it away. And now you are modifying the context and using it. And at any point, either you can say a store one more time, and if you do, it creates a stack of these context objects. And anytime you can do a restore, it grabs the first one from the context and brings over, from the stack and brings over, and you can restore back to the previous state. This comes in fairly handy because you can then write code in a way, you do some preparation, use it, store it away, and modify the context. And then at any time you can say, bring it back to the old shape and continue. And that model becomes very powerful to use. So take a look at store and restore if you are interested in looking at a little bit more about it. Now that we have seen this, let's go back to this and work through a slightly different example here. What I want to do is I want to change this just a little bit. Let's make the radius itself much smaller so that we can kind of take a look at some little animation example, if you will. So notice in this case, the circle is sitting right there in the center, but what if you really want to do some animations? Animation is a lot of fun, but we have to be very careful. Remember, you are in JavaScript. You don't have the luxury of the threads like you normally do in Java programming or in .NET programming. So you have to be a bit careful how you do these things. Now, in a way, oh, please, yes, please.
Yeah. So as you told, Java is a single-threaded. So, but Java also supports asynchronous programming.
Correct. That's what we're going to use here. The word asynchronous is a bit of a stretch, in my opinion. To me, we will use this term, by the way, because it's a term people use. But a lot of terms are misguided in a lot of ways. To me, asynchronous programming usually means that you let a thread go do a stuff while you go do things, and then it comes back and informs you. Yes, JavaScript does that. But the difference is there's only one thread still in the entire thing. In an asynchronous world like in .NET, you have multiple threads that are asynchronous. That's not the case in JavaScript. So for example, let's say you do asynchronous in JavaScript, and you say, do this operation in another timer, a set timeout, and then in that code you start spinning for another 5 minutes. There is no asynchrony because everything blocks up. So it's asynchrony within a single threaded environment. The asynchrony in JavaScript really comes in when the thing you called is actually an external process. But as long as you're within the JavaScript itself, you still are in this one thread, so you got to be very careful. So the way you do things in JavaScript is you would slice up your work into smaller chunks, and then you would do it. It's kind of like the bird sitting and eating food. Every few seconds they turn around to see if there's a threat around him. It's kind of the same model, right? You do a little work and you see if there's anything else I have to do, and then you come back and do a little bit work. It's kind of frustrating. But the next thing to keep in mind is when you're writing code in JavaScript, how do you do animation? The way I look at animation is it's kind of like a magic that you do. So you have a certain state of what you want to show, and then you kind of change the state, and then you draw the state, and then you expose it. So this is essentially what you do in animation is you want to prepare these things and move things around. So how can we go about doing this? Now, the number one recommendation I have for you in this case is, once again, good programming practices go a very long way. And that is modularize your code a lot. If you don't modularize your code, what you will end up with very quickly is a spaghetti mess in front of you. And debugging this code is what you definitely don't want to do. So create it very modular so it becomes very easy. So notice what I'm going to do. There are some really fantastic things that JavaScript provides for us. One of them is closures, and another is lexical scoping. Closures are anonymous functions, and pretty much when you create a function in JavaScript, 90% of the time you're creating closures. But also, lexical scoping gives you access to variables that are in a defining context into your own context, so that can become very manageable. So notice what I'm going to do here. I drew a circle here, but this is really embedded here. This can be very messy to deal with, and you don't want to write code like this. It becomes really hard to maintain. So what I'm going to do here is, notice I've kept the context over here. I've stored the width and the height over here. I'm quietly going to move the radius up here as well. So I've stored away these values and the center. So I've got these values sitting up here. Now I'm going to define draw circle as a function right here. Now here is the beauty. I'm defining a function within another function, but this function is kind of special. It is actually a closure. And because it's a closure, this function draw circle has all full access to all the variables in the context in which it's defined. It also has access to the parameter that's coming into this other function as well. So the advantage of this is I don't have to pass in the canvas, pass in the context. I don't have to send him all of that. It's already available. It's kind of like I can reach in and I have the context and the canvas available to me. And the only thing I want to pass to this function is what I want to be different in its own context, right? So that makes coding a lot easier to work with. So I want to draw a circle, but what do I want to tell him? I want to tell him where to draw the circle. So I'm going to say over here, the center is what I want to pass to him to tell him where to draw the circle. Now, once I give him the center, I'm going to go grab all this code, and I'm going to simply move that code in here for a second. And notice in this case, I use the word the center. So I'm going to tell him use the center and the center here. And the radius is the same radius as above. That's perfectly fine. And that's all I'm going to do. And now I quietly say draw circle. And I'm going to say center is where I want to draw the circle. Now, of course, it made absolutely no difference, right? The output is still the same. But there is one thing that it helped to tell us, that I didn't already mess it up, right? It's still working. But now that we did this, notice what I can do now. I can now say, from here, rather than calling draw circle, I am going to write a set timeout function. And what am I going to do? I'm going to call a repeat draw over here. So I have a repeat draw comma, and I want to draw it every, let's say, 100 milliseconds. So what is this repeat draw that I'm referring to at this point? Well, repeat draw is another function I'm going to create. So I'll create a function called repeat draw equals function. Now there's one small detail, that a set timeout in this context doesn't take any parameters. So how do you deal with something that doesn't take parameters? Once again, lexical scoping is your friend. Because if you have a function that takes parameters, you can wrap it into another function that doesn't take parameters and call it, and then you can cache in this parameter. That comes in very handy. So what am I going to do at this point? I'm going to go ahead and call this function that I want to call. So in this case, I'm going to say draw circle. And I'm going to tell him to draw the circle at the center to begin with, right? That's where I want to draw the circle at. But every time I draw the circle, I may want to change the location where I want to draw this into. And so you can start changing the context of where you want to draw. But the first observation here is, notice that I put the request to draw the circle in an event, which is where the asynchrony comes in. So you said set timeout and then repeat draw, and you said go call that method. Now, unfortunately, though, when you do this, it is going to call this method just once, and it is done. There's no more action to perform. So rather than doing this, I will normally take this and move it here itself. So now you are saying, I want to call repeat draw method, and the repeat draw method will call the repeat draw in this function, and this will draw the circle, and then it will, after a delay, call itself to redraw itself. So it will keep repeating this call over and over. So this is a way you can start introducing animations. Now, when you start introducing animation this way, you would probably want to say where to draw, because you want to change the center and place location where you want to draw it. So you could say, for example, var circle location equals center, and then here you could say circle location. But once you finish drawing, you could tell him that circle location dot x plus equals circle location dot x, let's say plus, let's say 5, and then I could say circle location dot y plus equals, let's say 5 as well. So essentially what we are doing is we are saying, I want to have a circle location to begin with. I want to draw the circle at that location, which is the center. And then as soon as you draw, change my x and y, and then take a nap, right? Meaning yield control. And after a timeout, you come back, and then this will call this function one more time, which will draw the circle. But hopefully, if I did this correctly, it should draw the circle at a new location where we want to draw. Well, almost, right? So this basically started drawing things, but I forgot to tell him to remove what was there, right? So you got to tell him, go ahead and remove what you have. But there is another thing I have to tell him also. What if this guy runs out of the window in this case? So I could say, for example, if circle location dot x is greater than the width of the canvas itself, then I can say circle location dot x equals, and then you can decide where to go. You could say start at 0, for example. And similarly, else you could ask him to increase it. And then similarly, you could say for the y as well, you could do the same thing. And you could say start for the y, and in a similar way, change it to these values. So in this case, I'm saying start with the circle value of y. And I'm sure you can write this in a lot better way than I can write here as you sit down and start thinking about it. And of course, if this is more than the height itself, I want you to start changing it. So in this case, of course, I'm changing it, and you can see that it's going at different locations and drawing things, and you can start looking at how to do this. But how do I clear the stuff along the way? Now remember, in the repeat circle, you keep in mind that this is all about drawing things and removing things and drawing back things. So you probably want to just go ahead and clear the rectangle. So before you draw, you could say context.clear rect, and the rectangle I want to clear is going to be the entire circle's width and height, and I can tell him to clear the rectangle and redraw on it. And now we have a little animation going right there nicely because we cleared and are redrawing it. Now, one of the other things I would recommend you do is, at least this is my way of programming, I never write code for 15 minutes because I would rather fail in 10 seconds than fail in 30 minutes. So I would do very, very small incremental coding. I would maybe write a little test, a little code, and make sure I got things working. And I also check in code very frequently because I would come up with a wild idea suddenly. Oh, wouldn't it be so cool? And suddenly I'll be trying stuff, and within my 5 minutes I was like, that's a stupid idea. Why did I do that? Well, the beauty is I check the code into the version control. I can just throw the code out, bring it from the version control, and I'm back on my feet running. So we can start doing things like this, and now you can see how you can start drawing ping pongs and all those good stuff. So given this so far, how do you deal with mouse events? Now, I want you to keep in mind a couple of things. One is, not only do you want to think about mouse events, you also want to deal with touch events, because you probably want to use this app not only in the desktop, but also on a handheld smartphone or iPad or tablets. So one way to make this really bad is start doing events for mouses and touches separately. My recommendation is don't do that. Write the code in a way you work with a position, right, a context position. And you write the entire code based on the context position. Once you do it, go to the HTML page and write a separate event for the mouse click alone. So for example, in this case, let's go ahead and remove the timer here for a second. And maybe I want to know where to go click on it, right? So let's go ahead and remove the timer. So I'm going to just get rid of the timer. In this case, of course, it will just draw in one location. But I can then go over here to the HTML page, and I can start writing events over here. So document dot, and I can say add event listener, and the listener I'm interested in is called mouse move or mouse down. In this case, I could say mouse down event. And then I can provide him a function that I want to register to. So what function do I want to register? I could say display may be the function I want to register. But what is this display function, by the way? Well, the display function requires a certain parameter. So display equals function takes a mouse event, And of course, I can specify here a display over here and call the method. Now, but the problem is the display needs to know the context of the canvas and all those good stuff, how to get to it. A very easy way to do that is to write the code in the display draw function that you wrote here in a way that the draw function will do its stuff and set a timer off, and then in the very end, it returns to you a handler object. So normally what I tend to do is I would return a bunch of handler objects, and the handler object or functions would say, for a mouse event, call this function. For other events, call this function. And those already are tied to the context of the canvas already. So I don't get into this mess of passing bulky parameters around. So life becomes a lot easier. So once you register an event like this, it becomes very easy to work with. So how does this really look like? Let me show you an example of how we could put this to use. So I was mentioning that my son was interested in creating a game, and I don't think he really knew what he was getting into. He was working on an independent study in school. So in his 8th grade, they said, you can do whatever you want to. And he said, I want to develop a game. So that's what he wanted to do. And he said, and one of the rules the school has is, your parent cannot be your mentor. But he somehow convinced them. My dad is rarely home. He travels all the time. So he's a perfect candidate for being a mentor because he's, I'm going to talk to him as much as I would talk to other mentors. So the school said, fine, you can do it. So I was supposed to mentor him, and how do I mentor him? He doesn't know any programming whatsoever. He's never done programming before, and he said, I want to do this. I think this was pushing his limits for sure, and I told him that he has to learn everything and work on it. And the way I started teaching him is this. He wants to build this application. I said, you're going to build this application all by yourself. I'm not going to do anything for you, but I'm going to teach you enough to build it. And the way I taught this to him is there was not a single day I stood up and lectured to him. I would sit down and we would pair program and we would build little samples. My first thing was, let's write a hello world in HTML. Second was, let's go ahead and style it. The third was, let's put a little text box. And then I showed him how to write a calculator in HTML. So we were just doing these little projects along the way, and to the point where he got enough of what he needs to do, and then I said, I'm done, now you go build your own project. So he had to really go back and apply all of this in writing his project. So he wrote every single line of code he wrote himself. And of course, I did constant code review. So he knows things like dry principle now, where duplication of code is wrong. All these things he knows very well. So the game he actually built, I'll show you the code in just a minute, but the game he actually built is this one. So assuming my internet connection holds up here, I can show this to you. So he developed this particular game called Alien Invasion. And so essentially, let's play the difficult level here real quick. So there are some aliens trying to attack this poor guy who is kind of stuck over here. And they better go run quick and grab these bombs that are falling up here because these are ammunitions. So I want to use these. So this one here, by the way, is a little ammunition you can use. Oh, sorry, it's too late. I'm not fast at all today. So you can see that I lost the game. Let's refresh the game again. You can see how this will involve quite a bit of math and animations and everything. Most of this is very simple, though, once you kind of get a hang of it. And this was completely written by using HTML5 canvas. And in a 14-year-old can do this, I'm sure. We can handle this fairly easily as well. So in this case, of course, I'm going to grab this laser and then zap these guys out. Oops. Let's go ahead and grab the gun next and play with it. This is invincible. So if you select it, you can just defend the bombs. You don't have to worry about them. They don't touch you anymore. And of course, you're invisible for a little bit time until the clock goes out. Now I have to just wait for this. Let's throw this bomb on these guys. So right there, we threw the bomb on these guys. Stay out of those fires that are falling down. And now I have one ammunition on my hand, and I better be wise in using it. So I'm going to kind of stay here and try to attack this guy. Oh, that's one bomb wasted. So right there, oh, that's another wasted. So I don't think I'm going to win this game, am I? Well, that's kind of the game basically, is that you can kind of fire at them, and that gives you these abilities. And, got you. So, or not quite. So anyway, the whole point is, now we are kind of stuck there, where there's no more firepower on our hand, and we have to just wait. So that's an example of what he did, purely HTML5, purely Canvas, but of course a lot of code he had to write to do this. Let's go ahead and take a look at the example here. So this is the main file that you see here. Extremely simple. That's his HTML5 file, as you can see. He has a canvas width of 960 and 530. There's a source code reference and a start game function. That's it, right? That's all in HTML. And you look at the source code itself, whatever we saw here is exactly what he was doing. So we have a game starting function, and right there within the function, here is the place where we are registering the mouse events, as you can see. And then, of course, down below, we have set up all these various things. And one of the nice things he did was, he did unit testing of most of the code. So all the things related to detecting where you're clicking, by the way. Obviously, you need to know whether you're clicking on a rectangle, whether you're clicking on a circle. How do you do all of that? He used node unit to do the testing. So he writes node unit test. The code that has all the logic and algorithm are in a separate file, and they are separately unit tested. And then, of course, he threw it in here and started using it. And then, of course, within this, of course, there's quite a bit of code to say where the laser is, where the bomb is, where the gun is. These are all JSON objects, as you can see. And then, of course, the real effort comes in here, where we have the draw image function, which is going to draw the images. They are all asynchronous because you have to wait for the files to load up. And then, of course, these are the load image functions. And then eventually, there's a function to draw the stick figure, the guy who's moving around. There's a one to draw the ammunition, draw the stick, draw the hoverboard. I don't know if you noticed, but he's standing on a board, actually. And then, of course, the save context I talked about. Because I constantly have to go from restoring things and drawing different pieces together. And it was getting pretty hairy because we would draw something and draw this, and the whole picture would mess up. So we had to save the state on the context and restore it. And that became very easy. And then now we are drawing the head, drawing the stick figure. And then, of course, we got to know when he was hit and when he was, when he hit the alien. And all that is done down under here. So he draws the bullets when the bullet is being fired, and then, of course, perform the step. So this is where the repeat logic starts coming in, where he draws the aliens, draw the ammunition, draw the laser, draw the gun, draw the invincibility, draw through all of that, and then you can see what it does here, set timeout, perform step, exactly like the code I showed you a few minutes ago. The pattern is, you get into a function, do your work, and call yourselves back, right? All with. And then finally, of course, when the whole game was together, we found there were a number of bugs, of course. So it was kind of interesting for him to see that there's bugs to fix as well. So there's a good lesson to learn and do this. So as you can see, that's a lot of code. When I think about it, it's kind of scary to think that he had to write all of this. But of course, he had a terrible mentor who threatened him constantly, sitting next to him. So that is basically the game, purely putting the pieces together as we saw being developed in the exercise. So anyway, I hope that was useful for you. Thank you.